Tokyo hides some of the most haunted places in Japan, where true ghost stories have left locals terrified, like the cursed mansion of Setagaya, where a student's eerie encounter led to his mysterious death, or the abandoned house near Nakano Station, where a ghostly voice whispered an ominous warning. In Hanjo, a couple endured blood-curdling screams at 3 a.m., only to uncover a horrifying secret within their walls, proving that Tokyo's haunted houses hold terrifying Japanese urban legends waiting to be uncovered. In the quiet neighborhood of Setagaya, an old Western-style house stands apart from the modern Tokyo landscape surrounding it. Known locally as Kuroyuri Manor, the Black Lily Manor, this Victorian-inspired building has remained unoccupied for decades, its reputation tainted by whispers of tragedy and supernatural occurrences. The house is immediately striking. Tall windows that seem to watch passers-by, weathered stone walls partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, and a roof that peaks sharply against the sky. The once manicured gardens have grown wild and unruly, nearly obscuring the stone path that leads to the grand entrance. At night, locals claim to see lights flickering in windows that should be empty, moving through the house like phantom caretakers. For almost 50 years, no family has called Kuroyuri Manor home. The last residents, the Nakamura family, fled in 1963 after their youngest daughter was found dead at the bottom of the grand staircase, her neck broken at an impossible angle. According to neighborhood gossip, this wasn't the first unexplained death in the house. The Nakamuras left so hastily that they abandoned most of their possessions, as if something more terrifying than grief had driven them away. In the years that followed, strange incidents continued to surround the property. A real estate agent disappeared while showing the house to potential buyers in 1965, only to be found wandering aimlessly through Shinjuku 3 days later, unable or unwilling to explain where he'd been. He resigned immediately and moved to Hokkaido. The property was quietly withdrawn from the market. In 1971, a homeless family sought shelter in the manor during winter. Neighbors reported hearing children's laughter from within the abandoned house for several nights before an eerie silence fell. When authorities investigated, they found no one, only small handprints in the dust that led up the stairs to the third floor, ending abruptly at a blank wall. Our story begins in autumn of 1979. 5 students from Waseda University had gathered at a local izakaya to celebrate the end of their midterm exams. Toshiro, Kenji, Akiko, Mei, and Haruto, friends since their first year, were enjoying the warm glow of sake and companionship when Kenji brought up the subject of the abandoned mansion in Setagaya. "My cousin lived near that old house," he mentioned, his words slightly slurred. "He swears it's haunted by everyone who ever died there. Says they're trapped inside, never able to move on." Toshiro, always the skeptic, dismissed the story. "Every neighborhood has some abandoned building with ghost stories attached to it. I've walked past it before," Mei said quietly. "Sometimes the windows fog up from the inside, even on warm days, like someone is breathing against the glass." Akiko laughed nervously. "Don't tell me you actually believe in ghosts, Mei." Haruto, who had been silently listening to the conversation, suddenly suggested, "Why don't we go see it? Right now?" There was a moment of hesitation before Kenji's face lit up with excitement. "Perfect. Our own test of courage." An hour later, they stood before the rusted gates of Kuroyuri Manor. The autumn moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown garden. The alcohol-fueled courage that had brought them there was quickly fading in the cold night air. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," Akiko whispered, hugging herself against the chill. "We've already come all this way," Kenji insisted, pulling a small flashlight from his jacket pocket. 10 minutes inside, that's all. Then we'll have a story to tell everyone at university." The gate creaked loudly as Haruto pushed it open. They followed the broken stone path toward the house, finding the front door locked, but discovering a cellar entrance around the back. The rusty padlock broke easily in Kenji's hands. The dank smell of mildew and decay greeted them as they descended into the darkness. Toshiro bumped his head on the low-hanging pipe and cursed softly. The beam from Kenji's flashlight revealed cobwebs and abandoned furniture covered in decades of dust. "Watch your step," Haruto cautioned. "The floor doesn't feel very stable." They navigated through the cellar and found a door leading to what must have been the kitchen. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, illuminating dust particles that swirled around them. The kitchen still contained rusted pots and pans, dishes stacked neatly in cabinets, and a dining table set for a meal that was never served, a tableau frozen in time. "It's like they just vanished in the middle of dinner," Mara observed, her voice hushed. Moving into the dining room, Kenji's flashlight beam caught something on the wall, a family portrait. 5 faces stared back at them: a stern-looking father, a mother with sad eyes, 2 teenage boys, and a young girl wearing a ribbon in her hair. The girl's face had been scratched out of the photograph. "Someone wasn't a fan of the little princess," Kenji joked, but his laughter sounded hollow in the empty house. They continued their exploration, moving into a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase. Despite years of neglect, remnants of the house's former elegance remained: visible hand-carved banisters, ornate ceiling medallions, and fragments of a crystal chandelier scattered across the marble floor. "Listen," Akiko suddenly said, raising her hand. "Do you hear that?" They all fell silent. At first, there was nothing but the creaking of the old house. Then faintly, they heard what sounded like traditional Japanese folk music, as if from an old record player turned to low volume. "It's probably just coming from one of the neighboring houses," Toshiro reasoned, though they all knew the manor stood isolated from other buildings. "Let's check upstairs," Kenji suggested, already placing his foot on the first step of the grand staircase. As they ascended, the wood creaking beneath their weight, the music neither grew louder nor fainter, maintaining a perfect distance, as if moving with them. The second floor contained several bedrooms, each filled with furniture draped in sheets that had yellowed with age. In what appeared to be a child's room, they found toys from another era: a wooden kokeshi doll, a tin train set, and a small music box. May reached toward the music box, her fingers hovering over its tarnished lid. "Don't touch anything," Haruto warned. "We shouldn't disturb this place." Without warning, the overhead light flickered once, twice, then blazed to life, filling the room with harsh brightness. They froze, staring at each other in shock. "The electricity shouldn't be working," Toshiro whispered, his face pale in the sudden light. "This place has been abandoned for decades." As suddenly as it had come on, the light went out, plunging them back into darkness save for Kenji's flashlight. "That was weird," Kenji admitted, his earlier bravado weakening. "Maybe we should." "Toshiro." The whisper was so faint that Toshiro thought he'd imagined it, but then it came again, closer, as if someone had leaned in next to his ear. "Toshiro." He spun around. "Who's doing that? It's not funny." The others looked at him in confusion. "Doing what?" Akiko asked. "Someone just whispered my name." May moved closer to Haruto, gripping his arm. "I didn't hear anything." Akiko. Now it was Akiko who jumped, her eyes widening with fear. "There! Did you hear that?" Before anyone could respond, they all heard it. 5 distinct whispers, each saying one of their names, overlapping in a chilling chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Let's get out of here," Kenji said, his voice cracking. "Now." They moved quickly toward the stairs, no longer concerned with exploring. As they reached the top of the staircase, May gasped and pointed down into the foyer. Standing directly beneath the broken chandelier was a figure, a young girl in a white dress, her long black hair obscuring her face. She stood motionless, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Go!" Haruto shouted, pushing the others toward the stairs. They descended in a panicked rush, nearly tripping over each other. As Toshiro, last in line, reached the middle of the staircase, he felt it, an icy grip around his ankle, so cold it burned through his jeans. He looked down and saw a pale hand with long fingers wrapped around his leg. "Something's got me," he screamed, kicking frantically. Kenji rushed back. grabbing Toshiro's arm and pulling hard. The invisible grip released suddenly, sending both boys tumbling down the remaining stairs. They scrambled to their feet and ran for the cellar door, not daring to look back. Outside, they collapsed on the overgrown lawn, gulping the fresh night air. For several minutes, no one spoke, their ragged breathing the only sound. "Did you all see her?" Mare finally asked, her voice barely audible. They nodded, except for Toshiro, who sat with his head in his hands. "Something grabbed me," he said, pulling up his jeans to reveal an angry red mark around his ankle. 5 distinct finger-shaped bruises already forming. It was so cold. "We need to leave," Haruto insisted. "Now." None of them argued. They made their way back to the train station in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they parted ways that night, there was an unspoken agreement. They would never speak of what happened at Kuroyuri Manor. For several weeks, life returned to normal. They attended classes, studied for exams, and tried to forget their experience. But Toshiro began to change. The bruise on his ankle didn't fade. Instead, it darkened, spreading slowly up his leg like a creeping infection. He became withdrawn, missing classes and ignoring calls from his friends. When Kenji finally went to check on him, he found Toshiro's apartment door unlocked. Inside, the air was frigid despite the autumn heat, and every mirror had been covered with sheets. Toshiro sat huddled in a corner, unwashed and unshaven, muttering to himself. "She followed me home," he whispered when he saw Kenji. "She stands at the foot of my bed every night, watching, waiting." Kenji convinced Toshiro to stay with him that night, but Toshiro insisted on sleeping on the floor, saying he no longer trusted beds. In the morning, Kenji awoke to find Toshiro gone. A note on the table simply read, "She's calling me back." 3 days later, Toshiro's body was discovered in his apartment by the building manager, responding to complaints about a strange smell. According to the police report, he had been dead for approximately 72 hours. His body was found contorted in an impossible position, spine bent backward, limbs twisted as if someone had wrung him like a wet cloth. The official cause of death was ruled as a seizure, though no medical history of epilepsy existed. Most disturbing were the words written in Toshiro's journal, found clutched in his rigid hand. "She's standing in the corner again tonight. She says the others are waiting for me at the house. She says, I need to go back. I think I will. I think I must." In the weeks that followed, the remaining 4 friends drifted apart, bound by a secret they couldn't share and a fear they couldn't name. Kenji dropped out of university and moved back to his hometown. Akiko transferred to a school in Osaka. Mei and Haruto stayed, but they avoided each other in the halls, as if seeing one another would somehow summon whatever had taken Toshiro. A year later, to the day, Kenji was found dead in his family's garden shed. Like Toshiro, his body was grotesquely twisted. 6 months after that, Akiko disappeared from her apartment in Osaka. Her case remains unsolved. Mei and Haruto, perhaps realizing they couldn't escape separately, eventually reconnected. They married quietly and moved to America, where they lived under different names. They never spoke of that night, even to each other, as if saying it aloud would give it power. The manor still stands in Setagaya today. Developers have attempted to purchase the property multiple times, but each transaction has fallen through under mysterious circumstances. The most recent attempt was in 2010, when a construction crew arrived to demolish the building. The project was abandoned after 3 workers died in unexplained accidents within the first week. Local authorities have since declared the property condemned, but no one has made any effort to tear it down. Instead, a tall fence surrounds it, warning people to keep out. Not that the warning is needed. Most locals take the long way around rather than walk past its gates. Sometimes, late at night, people report seeing lights moving through the house. Not electric lights, but the warm glow of paper lanterns, as if a festival from another time is taking place inside its walls. And occasionally, someone will report hearing music, or laughter, or the sound of children playing. But most disturbing are the reports from those who live nearby, who say that sometimes in the early hours before dawn, they see 5 young people walking up the path to the front door, 4 boys and a girl, their faces eager and animated, as if they're embarking on an adventure. They always enter. They never come out. If you find yourself in Setagaya, you might be tempted to seek out Kuroyuri Manor. Perhaps you're skeptical of ghost stories. Perhaps you think this tale is just urban legend, exaggerated over time. But before you test your courage, consider this. In 2018, a university student named Hiroshi Tanaka came across this story online. Intrigued, he did some research and discovered that the names Toshiro, Kenji, Akiko, Mei, and Haruto matched a group of Waseda University students who had all died or disappeared between 1979 and 1981. Hiroshi posted his findings on a paranormal forum, announcing his intention to visit the manor and document his experience. His last post was on the 18th of October, 2018. Standing outside the gate now, the house doesn't look as scary as I expected. We'll update when I'm inside. He never posted again. His phone was found 3 days later, on the stone path leading to the front door. The camera roll contained dozens of photos of empty rooms except for the last image, which showed a blurry figure standing at the top of a grand staircase, arm outstretched as if in invitation. What draws people to places like Kuroyuri Manor? Perhaps it's the thrill of facing our fears, or the desire to prove that death isn't the end. Or maybe, for some, it's the whisper of a voice that knows your name, a voice that promises you'll never be alone again, if only you're brave enough to answer its call. Would you answer? If you've had experiences with haunted places, or if you know more about the cursed manor of Setagaya, share your stories in the comments below. And remember, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. In the shadow of Tokyo's ever-evolving skyline, nestled between modern apartment buildings and convenience stores, stands a 2-story wooden house that time seems to have forgotten. Located just a 15-minute walk from the bustling Nakano station, the house appears remarkably unremarkable at first glance. Traditional Japanese architecture with a tiled roof, wooden exterior darkened by decades of exposure, and a small garden now choked with weeds. Yet despite Tokyo's notorious housing shortage and the premium value of land, this property has remained unoccupied and untouched for over 70 years. Local residents call it the Musubiya House, named after the family who allegedly lived there in the 1940s. While neighboring properties have been sold, demolished, and rebuilt multiple times into sleek apartments and commercial spaces, the Musubiya House stands defiant against modernization. Its very presence an anomaly in a city that constantly reinvents itself. The house first gained its unsettling reputation in the early 1950s. According to neighborhood accounts, the Musubiya family, consisting of husband Takashi, wife Akemi, and their young son Hiroshi, lived there peacefully until 1949, when Takashi suddenly became possessive and controlling. Neighbors reported hearing terrible arguments, and Akemi was rarely seen outside anymore. Then, one winter night, all sounds from the house ceased. The family simply vanished. When relatives came to investigate, they found no signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies, just an empty house with dinner still set on the table, as if the family had stepped away mid-meal and never returned. Most peculiar was the front door, which had been nailed shut from the inside. The police investigation yielded no answers, and eventually the case was filed away among Tokyo's many post-war mysteries. The property passed to distant relatives who refused to live there, yet oddly, they also refused to sell it. Over the decades, 3 different families attempted to purchase and renovate the house, but each time the renovations were abandoned halfway through. Contractors complained of tools disappearing, strange sounds in empty rooms, and an overwhelming sense of dread that intensified the longer they stayed inside. One worker claimed he heard a woman's voice frantically whispering, he's coming back," though he was alone in the house at the time. By the 1980s, real estate agents in Nakano had developed an unspoken agreement to avoid listing the property. It was considered bad luck to even discuss it with clients. The house grew more dilapidated each year, yet somehow never quite deteriorated enough to be condemned. Locals took the long way around to avoid walking past it, especially at dusk, when some claimed to see a woman's silhouette watching from the second-floor window. Our story truly begins in the spring of 1988, when a young real estate agent named Daisuke Yamada joined a new agency in Nakano. Ambitious and eager to make his mark, Daisuke was unaware of the local taboos surrounding the Musubiya house. When he discovered it wasn't listed in any property databases despite its prime location, he saw an opportunity to distinguish himself from his colleagues. After several inquiries, Daisuke learned that the house was technically owned by an elderly woman living in Hokkaido, a great niece of the original Musubiya family. When he contacted her about potentially listing the property, she seemed surprised but not opposed to the idea. "No one has asked about that house in years," she told him over the phone, her voice carrying a hint of caution. "If you want to assess it, I can mail you the key, but I recommend visiting during daylight hours only." 2 weeks later, on a bright April morning, Daisuke stood before the weathered wooden gate of the Musubiya house, camera in hand, and property assessment forms tucked into his briefcase. Cherry blossoms swirled in the breeze around him, incongruously cheerful against the house's grim facade. Despite the sunshine, the property seemed to exist in its own shadow. The front garden had long ago surrendered to weeds and wild bamboo. A stone pathway, partially visible beneath the overgrowth, led to the front entrance. Strangely, while the exterior showed signs of neglect, it wasn't nearly as deteriorated as Daisuke had expected for a house abandoned for 4 decades. The key turned smoothly in the lock, as if the door had been recently oiled. The smell that greeted him wasn't the anticipated mustiness of long abandonment, but rather the faint scent of tatami mats and incense, the smell of a lived-in home. What Daisuke found inside defied all logic. Rather than a decrepit interior ravaged by time, the house appeared to be perfectly preserved, as if someone had been meticulously maintaining it. The tatami mats were worn but clean, the wooden surfaces polished with care. In the kitchen, dishes were stacked neatly in cabinets. A calendar on the wall displayed March 1949, its pages yellowed but intact. "This is impossible," Daisuke whispered to himself as he wandered through the ground floor, taking photographs with his camera. The dining area still had a low table set for 3, complete with chopsticks and bowls. A man's jacket hung by the door, and a woman's scarf was draped over a chair, as if its owner had just stepped out momentarily. On a small desk in the corner lay open books and papers, household accounts in elegant handwriting, stopping abruptly mid-entry on the 15th of March, 1949. As Daisuke moved through the house, he felt an increasing sense of unease. The preservation of everything seemed too perfect, too deliberate. It was less like an abandoned house and more like a museum exhibit, or a trap, set and waiting to be sprung. On the second floor, he found 2 bedrooms. The smaller one clearly belonged to a child, with toys from another era arranged carefully on shelves, and a small futon rolled up in the corner. A school uniform hung on a hook, pressed and ready for the next day, a day that had never come. The master bedroom contained a larger futon and dresser, but what caught Daisuke's attention was the vanity table. On it sat a woman's hairbrush with strands of long black hair still caught in the bristles, a bottle of perfume, and a small mirror. Reflected in the mirror, Daisuke thought he saw a flash of movement behind him. He spun around, but the room was empty. Just nerves, he told himself, though his heart was racing. The final room on the second floor had its door closed. Unlike the rest of the house, this door showed signs of damage, deep scratches on the wood, as if someone had desperately tried to claw their way in or out. Daisuke hesitated before turning the handle, finding it unlocked. The room beyond was empty, except for a single wooden chair facing the window. Unlike the rest of the meticulously preserved house, this room was thick with dust and cobwebs. The single window was covered with paper, allowing only thin strips of light to filter through. Daisuke approached the window and peered through a tear in the paper. The view overlooked the street, but something about the perspective seemed wrong, as if the window existed in a different spatial relationship to the outside world than it should have. As he turned to leave the room, his camera strap caught on the door handle. Yanking the camera from his hands, it clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent house. And then another sound, a voice so close it could have been whispering directly into his ear. "Please don't let him in." The voice was female, gentle but urgent, filled with a terror so profound that Daisuke felt it like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, heart pounding, eyes darting around the empty room. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking. "Is someone here?" Silence answered him. Then from somewhere downstairs came the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. Heavy footsteps crossed the entryway below, slow and deliberate. They paused, then began ascending the stairs, each step a measured thud that sent vibrations through the floorboards beneath Daisuke's feet. Frozen in fear, Daisuke stared at the open doorway, waiting for whoever or whatever was climbing the stairs. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped just outside the room. In that moment of terrible silence, the woman's voice came again, now barely audible. "Hide, please hide." Galvanized by terror, Daisuke snatched up his camera and rushed to the window. His fingers fumbled with the latch, finally prying it open. The drop to the ground was considerable, but fear gave him no choice. As a dark shadow fell across the doorway, Daisuke climbed out and let himself hang from the windowsill before dropping into the overgrown garden below. His ankle twisted painfully upon landing, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He limped frantically toward the gate, not daring to look back at the house. As he reached the street, a sudden gust of wind slammed the front door shut with such force that the sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Daisuke didn't stop running until he reached the station, his shirt soaked with sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Only then did he realize he was still clutching his camera, his knuckles white around its body. That evening, as his breathing steadied and his rational mind began to reassert itself, Daisuke tried to convince himself that he had imagined the whole incident: the voice, the footsteps. Perhaps the wind had blown the door open and closed. Perhaps his isolation in the long, empty house had played tricks on his mind. But when he developed the film from his camera the next day, the truth became undeniable. Every photograph he had taken inside the house was blank, completely exposed, showing nothing but white. All except for the last one, taken in the empty room with the chair. In that image, blurred but unmistakable, stood a woman by the window. Her face was turned away, her long hair loose down her back, her hand reaching out as if in warning or supplication. Daisuke never returned to the Musubiya house, but he couldn't forget what he had experienced there. Over the following weeks, he delved into old newspapers and public records, searching for information about the vanished family. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. According to police reports from 1949, when relatives reported the family missing, the first officers on the scene had indeed found the front door nailed shut from the inside. But when they finally broke in, they found the house completely empty, no furniture, no personal belongings, nothing to indicate anyone had lived there for years. This directly contradicted what Daisuke had seen. Even stranger, he found a news clipping from 1951 reporting that Takashi Musubiya had been found in Osaka, claiming to have no memory of his wife and son or their disappearance. He told authorities that he had awakened in a hospital with amnesia 2 years earlier. When police brought him back to Nakano to see if the house would trigger his memories, he reportedly became hysterical upon seeing it, screaming, "She won't let me in. She's still keeping me out." Takashi was eventually committed to a psychiatric hospital where he died in 1965, still insisting that his wife was somehow keeping him trapped outside his own home. As for Akemi and young Hiroshi, they were never found. In the months following his visit, Daisuke was plagued by dreams in which he heard the woman's voice begging him not to let him in. He would wake up to find his room ice cold, no matter the season. Once, he awoke to discover his camera on his bedside table, though he distinctly remembered storing it in his closet. When he checked it, he found a new photograph showing the exterior of the Musubiya house at night, with 2 silhouettes visible in the upstairs window, a woman and a small child. Daisuke left his job at the real estate agency and moved away from Tokyo later that year. Before leaving, he visited an elderly neighbor who lived across from the Musubiya house and had been there since the 1940s. The old man initially refused to discuss the house, but when Daisuke showed him the photograph of the woman by the window, his weathered face paled. "That's Akemi," he whispered, "but you don't understand. Takashi was changing, not eating, not sleeping. He would stand outside for hours, staring at nothing. The night before they vanished, I heard Akemi screaming that he wasn't her husband anymore, that something else was wearing his skin." The old man's hands trembled. No one believed her, of course, but I saw him that last night, standing in the street looking up at their window. His eyes, they weren't human eyes anymore. The Musubiya house still stands in Nakano today, unchanged despite the decades that have passed. Real estate developers have repeatedly attempted to acquire the property, but ownership remains tangled in legal complications that never seem to resolve. Construction crews sent to evaluate the site report equipment failures and inexplicable accidents. Most peculiar are the reports from local residents about the house's appearance. Some days, it looks appropriately dilapidated, roof sagging, wood rotting, garden overgrown. But other days, usually at dusk, the house appears freshly maintained, as if still waiting for its owners to return. Occasionally, passers-by report seeing a woman in the second-floor window, sometimes accompanied by a small boy. They stand together, watching the street below, as if waiting for someone or warning those who might enter. In 2015, an American paranormal investigation team attempted to document the house for a television show. Their equipment malfunctioned as soon as they stepped inside, and the lead investigator suffered a mysterious seizure in the empty upstairs room. Most disturbing was the audio recording recovered from their backup device. See a woman's voice, speaking in Japanese, repeating urgently, "He's outside. He's still outside. Don't let him in. He's not my husband anymore." The show never aired. Some say that Akemi found a way to create a sanctuary within the house, a space frozen in time where she and her son could hide from whatever had taken possession of Takashi. Others believe that the house itself is the entity, having consumed the family and now preserving their essence within its walls. The most chilling theory, whispered among older Nakano residents, is that Takashi did return home that night in 1949, but not as himself. Whatever was wearing his skin found itself locked out by Akemi's desperate final act, nailing the door shut from the inside. And it still waits outside, patiently, eternally, seeking entry to claim what it believes belongs to it. If you find yourself in Nakano and come across an old Japanese house that seems out of place among the modern buildings, walk past quickly. Don't pause to take photographs. Don't peer through the windows. And if you hear a woman's voice urgently whispering, "Please don't let him in, run," because something is still waiting outside the Musubiya house, wearing a human face but carrying inhuman intentions. And sometimes, On cold nights when the moon is hidden, locals report seeing a man standing in the street, staring up at the second-floor window with eyes that reflect no light, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally open the door and let him in. The autumn of 1993 brought more than just falling leaves to the quiet district of Honjo. For Takashi and Mei Yamada, it brought the promise of a fresh start in a city that had been unforgiving to them. Tokyo's economic bubble had burst years earlier, leaving the young couple struggling to make ends meet. Takashi had lost his position at a financial firm, forcing them to abandon their comfortable apartment in Shibuya. Now, with their savings dwindling and Mei's part-time work at a local convenience store barely covering their essentials, they had found what seemed like an unexpected blessing. A traditional Japanese house available for rent at an astonishingly low price. "It's perfect," Mei whispered as they stood before the wooden structure. Despite its age, the house retained much of its traditional charm: sliding Fusuma doors, tatami mats that released a subtle, earthy scent when walked upon, and shoji screens that filtered the sunlight into gentle patterns across the floor. The landlord, Mr. Tanaka, an elderly man with permanently stooped shoulders and eyes that never quite met theirs, shuffled around the property during their viewing. "Not many want traditional homes these days," he explained, gesturing vaguely with a gnarled hand. "Everyone wants modern apartments, concrete, steel, Western toilets." He chuckled, but the sound died quickly in his throat. "Why has it been empty so long?" Takashi asked, noting the slight discoloration of the wooden beams, the way certain corners of the house seemed to hold shadows even in daylight. Mr. Tanaka's eyes darted toward the innermost wall of the main living area, then quickly away. "People today want convenience. This neighborhood is old, not fashionable." He shuffled toward the entrance. "The price is fair. You won't find better in Tokyo." That much was true, and so, despite the flutter of unease that passed between them, a look exchanged but not acknowledged, Takashi and Mei signed the rental agreement the following day. Moving in took little time. Their possessions had been whittled down to essentials during their financial descent. By nightfall, they sat together on their futon, eating convenience store bentos and drinking cheap sake, making hopeful plans for the first time in months. "We can save now," Takashi said, his voice carrying the first hint of optimism Mei had heard in nearly a year. "With rent this low, we can build up our savings again. Maybe in a year, I can start my own consulting business." Mei nodded, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "It feels like we've turned a corner," she agreed. But as she spoke, her eyes drifted to the innermost wall, the one that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She shivered slightly, though the night wasn't particularly cold. Their first night passed uneventfully, exhaustion from moving claiming them quickly. The second night, too. By the third day, they had established a routine. Takashi would spend his mornings sending out resumes and applications, while Mei worked afternoon shifts at the convenience store. Their evenings were quiet but comfortable, as they slowly reclaimed their sense of stability in this old creaking house. On the fifth night, it happened. Takashi jolted awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. Disoriented, he fumbled for his watch. The digital display read 3 a.m. exactly. Beside him, Mei slept soundly, her breathing deep and undisturbed. He was about to settle back when he heard it again, the sound that had woken him. A scream, high-pitched and agonized, it seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the house. Takashi sat bolt upright, adrenaline flooding his system. The sound came again, a woman's voice contorted by what could only be described as primal terror or unbearable pain. "Mei," he hissed, shaking his wife awake. "Mei, wake up." She stirred groggily. "What is it?" Don't you hear that? Someone's screaming. May sat up, instantly alert. The scream came again, causing both of them to flinch. It seemed to emanate from inside the walls themselves, specifically from the innermost wall that had drawn May's attention on their first night. "Should we call the police?" May whispered, clutching Takashi's arm. He was already reaching for the phone when the screaming abruptly stopped. The silence that followed seemed more oppressive than the sound had been. They waited, tense and trembling, but nothing further disturbed the night. "Maybe it was a neighbor having a nightmare," May suggested, though her voice held little conviction. "Right through these thick walls?" Takashi shook his head. "Something's wrong. I'm going to check outside." He found nothing. No signs of disturbance, no neighbors awake and concerned. The surrounding houses remained dark and silent, as if the screams had been contained entirely within their own walls. The next morning, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, Takashi approached Mr. Tanaka at his small real estate office a few blocks away. "There were screams last night," Takashi said without preamble, "from inside our house." Mr. Tanaka's face remained impassive, but his fingers, resting on his desk, twitched slightly. "Old houses make strange noises," he replied. "Pipes, settling foundations, the wind through the eaves." "This wasn't the house settling," Takashi insisted. "It was a woman screaming, in agony." "You're imagining things," Mr. Tanaka said, his tone suddenly sharp. "Tokyo is stressful. The mind plays tricks when adjusting to a new home." Takashi left unsatisfied, but with no real recourse. They had signed a 6-month lease. Their finances couldn't withstand another move so soon. That night, at precisely 3 a.m., the screaming began again. This time, both Takashi and May were awake to hear it from the beginning. A low moan that quickly escalated into a blood-curdling shriek. It lasted for exactly 3 minutes before abruptly cutting off, as if a switch had been flipped. "It's coming from inside the wall," May whispered, her face pale in the dim light from their bedside lamp. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Always at 3 a.m., always lasting 3 minutes, always seeming to emanate from that same innermost wall. Takashi and May began taking turns staying awake, dreading the approaching hour. They tried sleeping in different rooms, but the screams penetrated every corner of the house with equal intensity. After 2 weeks of this torment, their nerves were frayed to breaking point. May had dark circles under her eyes, and Takashi had been rejected from 3 job interviews, his exhaustion evident to potential employers. They had approached neighbors, only to be met with averted gazes and quickly closed doors. One elderly woman had simply shaken her head and muttered, "You shouldn't have taken that house." "We need to know what's in that wall," Takashi finally said, after another sleepless night. It was Sunday. May didn't have work, and they sat at their small table, cups of tea growing cold between them. "What do you mean?" May asked, though she already knew. "I'm going to open it," Takashi replied, his voice flat with determination. "Tonight, before the screaming starts, I need to know what we're dealing with." May wanted to protest but found she couldn't. The constant disruption had taken its toll on both of them. "Okay," she whispered, "but be careful." That evening, Takashi gathered his tools: a hammer, a pry bar, a flashlight. The wall in question was covered with traditional washi paper over a wooden frame. It would be relatively easy to break through. At midnight, they positioned themselves before the wall. The house seemed to hold its breath around them, the usual creaks and settling noises conspicuously absent. "Ready?" Takashi asked, positioning the pry bar against the frame. May nodded, her throat too dry to speak. With a single decisive movement, Takashi drove the bar into the wall. The paper tore easily, and the wooden frame splintered with a crack that seemed explosively loud in the quiet house. May flinched, but stepped forward to help as Takashi widened the opening. Behind the thin wall was a narrow space, what would have been called a witch's closet in Western architecture, a hidden compartment created when the house was partitioned. Their flashlight beam illuminated dust motes, swirling in the disturbed air, and there, folded neatly at the bottom of the cramped space, lay a kimono. It was clearly old. The once vibrant crimson silk now faded to a dull rust color. Elaborate embroidery depicted cherry blossoms and cranes, though time had frayed the delicate stitching. As they stared at it, transfixed, May noticed dark stains spreading across the fabric, stains that, even in the poor light, were unmistakably blood. "We should put it back," she whispered, grabbing Takashi's arm. "We should seal up the wall and—" "No," Takashi interrupted. "This is what's causing it. We need to remove it from the house." With determination born of weeks of torment, he reached into the space and grasped the kimono. The moment his fingers touched the fabric, a cold draft surged through the room, extinguishing their flashlight. In the sudden darkness, May could have sworn she heard a sigh not of pain, but of release. They stumbled to find matches to relight their flashlight. When they finally had light again, Takashi was holding the kimono at arm's length. Up close, the bloodstains were even more evident, concentrated around the collar and sleeves. "Someone died in this," May said, her voice barely audible. "Someone died wearing this kimono." Takashi nodded grimly, and they sealed it up inside the wall. He looked up at the hole they had created, frowning. But why? They decided to burn the kimono. In the small backyard under the waning moon, they placed it in a metal trash can and set it alight. The silk caught quickly, curling and blackening. As the flames consumed it, both swore they could hear a distant keening, not the agonized screams of before, but a mournful wail that gradually faded as the fabric turned to ash. That night, 3 a.m. passed in blessed silence. Exhausted beyond measure, they fell into the first deep sleep they had experienced in weeks. May woke abruptly some time later. The room was dark, but a strange, diffuse light seemed to emanate from the corner furthest from their futon. She blinked, trying to orient herself, then froze as her eyes adjusted to the gloom. A woman stood in the corner. She wore a white kimono, a burial garment, her hair loose and unkempt around a face of terrible beauty. Her skin was paper white, her eyes sunken and dark. But it was her mouth that drew and held May's horrified gaze. It was open, stretched impossibly wide in what should have been a scream, but no sound emerged. The woman's jaw seemed dislocated by the force of her silent cry, her teeth exposed in a rictus of eternal agony. May tried to scream, to wake Takashi, but her voice caught in her throat. The apparition's eyes, previously fixed on some middle distance, suddenly locked with hers. In that moment, May felt a flood of foreign emotions: rage, betrayal, and beneath it all, a sorrow so profound it threatened to drown her. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, the woman vanished, leaving only the impression of her silhouette burned into May's vision. "Takashi," she finally managed, shaking her husband desperately. "Takashi, she's here. She's in the house." The following day, they sought out Mr. Tanaka again, this time with different questions. "Who lived in our house before? Who died there?" Takashi demanded, his exhaustion making him bold. Mr. Tanaka sighed heavily, his facade of ignorance finally crumbling. "It was long ago," he said, his voice suddenly old and frail. "Before my time, but stories persist." According to local legend, the house had belonged to a wealthy merchant in the early 1920s. He had taken a young wife, much celebrated for her beauty, but the merchant was possessive and cruel. When he suspected his wife of an affair with a local artist, he flew into a rage. They say he strangled her with her own obi, mister," Tanaka murmured, not meeting their eyes. "While she wore her favorite kimono, a red silk with embroidered cranes, then he sealed her body in the wall." "Her body?" May gasped. "But we only found the kimono." Mr. Tanaka looked up sharply. "The authorities discovered the crime when neighbors reported the smell. They removed her remains and buried them properly. But the kimono, he trailed off. It was said to be cursed by her dying breath. The family sealed it away, hoping to contain her rage." "And you rented us this house knowing this?" Takashi's voice shook with anger. "The screaming stopped decades ago," Mr. Tanaka protested weakly. I thought it was over." But it wasn't over. Though the nightly screams had ceased, the silent apparition now appeared regularly. Sometimes in the corner of their bedroom, sometimes at the foot of their futon, sometimes reflected in mirrors or windows when there was no one there to cast a reflection. Always with that impossibly wide, silent scream frozen on her face. May began to find strands of long black hair on her pillow, though neither she nor Takashi had hair longer than a few inches. Objects would move when they weren't looking. A cup placed on the table would be found smashed on the floor. Their clothes would be discovered torn as if by ghostly hands. Most disturbing of all, May began to wake with bruises around her throat, finger marks that matched the size of a woman's hand. "She thinks I'm him," May whispered one morning, examining the purple marks in their bathroom mirror. "She thinks I'm her husband." They tried everything: Buddhist prayers, Shinto cleansing rituals, Christian blessings. They scattered salt in the corners of the rooms and hung protective paper talismans from the doorways. Nothing helped. As weeks passed, they noticed a pattern. The apparition appeared most frequently to May, especially when she was alone. And the ghostly attacks, the bruises, the scratches that would sometimes appear on her skin intensified whenever Takashi raised his voice, even in ordinary conversation. "She sees him in you," a local spiritualist finally told them after being convinced to enter the house. The elderly woman had lasted less than 5 minutes before fleeing, her face ashen. "And she sees herself in your wife. She's reliving her trauma through you both." They broke their lease the next day, forfeiting their deposit and several months' rent. They packed only what they could carry and left the rest behind, unwilling to bring any object from that house into their new life. Years later, they would learn that the house in Honjo had been demolished, the land left vacant. Local children whispered that nothing would grow in that soil, that even weeds withered and died on that cursed plot of earth. But sometimes, on cold autumn nights, when the wind blows just right, residents of Honjo still report hearing a woman's scream at exactly 3 o'clock a.m. A sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, the eternal echo of a rage that found no peace. As for Takashi and May, they never spoke of the screaming house to anyone. But May would sometimes wake gasping from nightmares, her hands clutching at her throat, remembering the face of the woman with the endless, silent scream and wondering if, somewhere in that demolished house, a red kimono with embroidered cranes still existed, sealed within rubble and earth, waiting to be discovered again.